The house always felt the quietest around 6:12 in the morning. Not completely silent, just the kind of stillness that made small sounds seem unusually loud. The ticking clock above the stove, the soft hum of the refrigerator, wind brushing against the dry oak branches outside the kitchen window. Before the loss, mornings used to move differently there. Coffee brewing, a second mug waiting beside the sink, low conversations that barely needed words. But now the rooms held on to silence in a way that almost felt physical, like the air itself had become heavier overnight. And on that particular morning in late October, something about the house felt stranger than usual. The sky outside was pale gray, the kind of cold southern morning where the grass still glistens damp under the porch light. A thin layer of fog rested low over the backyard fence, barely moving. The narrator stood alone in thick socks on the hardwood floor, one hand wrapped around a warm coffee mug, staring absently into the yard without really looking at anything at all. Then something shifted. Not a sound at first, more like a feeling. The strange sensation that someone had just entered the room behind you, even when you know you're alone. And for reasons that didn't make sense, their eyes drifted toward the old cedar fence near the bird feeder. That's when they saw it. A single cardinal, bright red against the gray morning like a drop of color that didn't belong there. It wasn't moving. It wasn't pecking at seeds or hopping through the wet grass like birds usually do. It simply sat there on the fence post, perfectly still, facing the window. Watching. For several long seconds, neither moved. The coffee slowly cooled between trembling hands while the cardinal remained motionless in the morning fog, its crest barely stirring in the wind. And somehow, the silence around the house no longer felt empty. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because the story you're about to hear may quietly change the way you look at certain moments that seem too perfectly timed to ignore. But that was only the beginning, because what happened over the next few mornings would become far more difficult to explain. Over the next few days, the mornings began to follow the same quiet rhythm. The sky would slowly lighten behind the trees. The coffee maker would click on with its familiar sound. Cold air would gather softly against the kitchen window. And somewhere between the first sip of coffee and the moment the house fully woke up to another lonely day, that small red shape would appear again near the cedar fence. Sometimes it perched beside the feeder. Sometimes higher up in the maple branches where the last autumn leaves still trembled in the wind. But it was always there long enough to be noticed. And maybe you have experienced something similar after losing someone. Not necessarily with a bird. Sometimes it is a song arriving at the exact wrong moment. A familiar scent drifting through an empty room. The strange instinct to reach for your phone before remembering there is nobody left to call. Grief changes ordinary things in ways people rarely talk about. It slows time down. It sharpens silence. It makes the smallest details feel unusually important. The narrator started leaving the curtains open at night without really knowing why. Each morning became less about coffee and more about checking the fence before even turning on the kitchen light. And the strange part was not simply that the bird kept returning. It was the feeling that arrived a few seconds before it did. A subtle pull toward the window. A stillness in the chest. Like some quiet part of the mind already knew it was there. But the thing that truly began to feel unsettling was this. The cardinal never appeared on the easier mornings. It only came when the loneliness inside the house felt hardest to carry. By the second week, the narrator stopped thinking of the bird as random background movement. There was a pattern to it now. Not an obvious one at first. Something quieter. The cardinal never arrived with the noisy flocks that scattered across the yard in the afternoons. It came alone. Usually in the early morning when the air still carried that cold blue stillness before sunrise fully touched the trees. And it always chose the same places. The top corner of the cedar fence. The crooked branch. Hanging over the feeder. Once, the narrow railing beside the back porch steps where fallen leaves had gathered after a night of rain. Small details began standing out in ways they never had before. The bird rarely pecked at seed. It rarely stayed on the ground. Most of the time it simply watched the house, tilting its head slightly toward the kitchen window as though listening for something inside. Researchers have quietly observed that cardinals are highly aware of routine and territory. They remember safe spaces, familiar sounds, predictable movement. But this felt different from ordinary nesting behavior. There were mornings when the narrator would wake unexpectedly at exactly the same time, pulled from sleep by nothing they could explain. only to find the Cardinal already waiting outside in the dim light. And once you notice something like that, it becomes difficult to stop noticing. The world begins revealing tiny layers hidden beneath everyday life. The movement of branches, the silence between bird calls, the strange timing of things that seem too precise to be accidental. But what unsettled the narrator most was not the bird itself. It was the growing feeling that the Cardinal had not chosen the house by chance at all. There are things the human mind notices long before it understands them. Tiny repetitions, changes in rhythm, patterns hidden inside ordinary life. Psychologists sometimes describe intuition as the brain quietly processing information beneath conscious awareness, detecting subtle details before logic has time to explain them. And grief seems to sharpen that process even more. After loss, people often become unusually sensitive to sound, timing, movement, and emotional association. The narrator did not know any of this at the time. They only knew the mornings no longer felt random. One cloudy Thursday, cold rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows before sunrise. The yard was empty. No movement near the feeder. No red shape on the fence. And strangely, the absence felt immediate. Heavy, like walking into a room where someone should have been waiting. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the Cardinal finally appeared, landing silently beneath the maple tree with rainwater glistening across its feathers. The narrator felt their chest loosen the moment they saw it, and that reaction lingered in their mind long afterward. Because that was the unsettling part. The bird had slowly stopped feeling like an outside object. It had become tied to emotion itself. Researchers have observed that the human brain forms powerful associations during periods of grief, especially around recurring sensory experiences. A specific song, a scent, a familiar light through a window. The mind begins attaching meaning to moments that repeat during emotional pain. And maybe that explains everything. Maybe the Cardinal was simply becoming part of the narrator's healing process without them realizing it. But even then, there remained one quiet detail that still felt difficult to explain. The bird always arrived seconds after the loneliness became unbearable, never before, and never too late. Without realizing it, the narrator began changing small routines around the house. The old bird feeder near the cedar fence had been empty for months, hanging crooked beneath the tree where autumn wind kept scattering leaves across the yard. One cold Saturday morning, they quietly carried a small bag of seed outside and filled it again. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once before the neighborhood settled back into silence. The Cardinal arrived less than 10 minutes later. Not hurried, not startled. It landed softly on the fence post first, as if waiting. Then it moved toward the feeder in careful little hops, its bright feathers glowing against the dull November sky. The narrator stood just inside the sliding glass door, fingertips resting lightly against the cold handle, barely breathing so the moment would not disappear. Strange how attachment forms, not through grand events, but through repetition, through tiny rituals that quietly begin stitching themselves into daily life. The sound of wings brushing branches, the faint tapping of claws against wood, the familiar flash of red appearing in the same corner of the yard each morning. Over time, the narrator noticed something else. On the hardest days, the Cardinal stayed longer. Sometimes it perched close enough for tiny details to become visible. The dark shine of its eyes, the thin movement of its chest rising in the cold air. Once, just before sunrise, it remained completely still while snow began drifting softly through the yard around it. And standing there alone in the dim kitchen light, the narrator felt something they had not felt in weeks. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling that maybe they were not carrying the grief entirely alone anymore. By early December, the Cardinal no longer felt connected only to the mornings. Somehow, it had begun appearing at moments that seemed emotionally precise in ways the narrator could not comfortably explain. One evening just after sunset, they sat alone on the back steps wrapped in an old flannel jacket, watching cold wind move through the bare trees beyond the fence line. The sky had turned that deep winter blue that arrives right before darkness settles completely. Somewhere nearby, dry leaves scraped softly across the pavement. It had been an especially difficult day. One of those quiet anniversaries the calendar does not warn you about until you suddenly feel the weight of it in your chest. The narrator had spent most of the evening avoiding certain rooms in the house, avoiding old photographs, avoiding memories that still felt too sharp to touch for very long. And without thinking, they finally whispered something into the cold air that had remained unspoken for weeks. "I just wish I knew you were still near somehow." The yard remained completely still afterward. No wind, no sound from the trees, just the distant hum of traffic far beyond the neighborhood. Then, almost immediately, wings cut softly through the silence. The Cardinal landed on the porch railing less than 3 feet away, close enough for every detail to become visible in the fading light. Tiny droplets of rain clinging to crimson feathers, dark eyes reflecting the dim glow from the kitchen window behind them. It did not startle. It did not fly. It simply remained there, impossibly calm, as though it had arrived in answer to something the narrator had not meant to say aloud. And this was the moment everything began to feel larger than coincidence. Because over the following days, the pattern became even stranger. Winter settled deeper around the neighborhood after that. Mornings arrived later now, wrapped in silver fog and long shadows that stretched across the yard before the sun fully rose above the trees. Some days the Cardinal appeared only briefly. Other mornings it remained for nearly an hour, quiet and watchful beside the feeder, while steam drifted slowly from the narrator's coffee cup inside the kitchen. And somewhere during those cold December weeks, the story stopped feeling entirely personal. Because once people experience something difficult to explain, they often begin searching for others who have felt it too. Late at night, unable to sleep, the narrator found themselves reading old stories online from strangers, describing almost identical moments. A red bird appearing after loss. A sudden feeling of calm during grief. Unexplainable timing. Small encounters that stayed with people for years afterward. Many believed cardinals carried emotional messages after someone passed away. Others viewed them simply as symbols of endurance, presence, or memory. And perhaps there is a reason those stories continue across generations and cultures. Human beings have always searched for meaning in the natural world, especially during periods of heartbreak. We notice the things that arrive when we need comfort most. We remember moments that interrupt loneliness in unexpected ways. Whether spiritual or psychological, something about that feels deeply human. The narrator never fully decided what they believed. But there were evenings now when they would leave the porch light glowing softly after sunset, almost as if expecting company. And strangely enough, the Cardinal often appeared during those exact moments, perched silently beneath the amber light while darkness settled around the yard. But what happened one snowy morning near Christmas would change the feeling of the entire experience completely. Snow arrived quietly that Christmas week. Not a heavy storm, just a slow, steady snowfall that softened the neighborhood and covered the backyard in a thin white silence. Early one morning, before sunrise, the narrator stood alone near the kitchen window watching pale flakes drift beneath the porch light. The house still carried that familiar emptiness, but something about it no longer felt as sharp as it once had. Grief was still there. It probably always would be, but it had changed shape somehow, become quieter, less like drowning and more like carrying something delicate through the dark. The Cardinal appeared just as the first blue light touched the trees. It landed softly on the cedar fence, bright against the snow, almost unreal in the stillness of the yard. This time the narrator did not rush toward the window, did not search for explanations. They simply stood there holding a warm mug between both hands, breathing slowly while the bird remained motionless beneath the falling snow. And for a long moment, the entire world seemed suspended. No traffic, no wind, no sound except the faint ticking clock behind them in the kitchen. Many people believe healing does not happen through answers. It happens through presence, through small moments that gently remind us we are still connected to life, even after loss changes everything familiar. Watching the Cardinal in that quiet winter light, the narrator realized something they had not understood before. Maybe the bird had never come to erase grief. Maybe it arrived simply to sit beside it for a while. And somehow, that felt even more meaningful. The Cardinal stayed until the snow finally thickened around the yard, then lifted silently into the pale morning sky, leaving the fence empty once again. But the emptiness no longer felt the same. The Cardinal did not disappear after Christmas, but the visits slowly became less predictable, softer somehow, as if whatever needed to happen inside that quiet little house had already begun. Some mornings the narrator would wake before dawn and find the fence empty beneath the pale winter sky. Other days, the familiar red shape appeared without warning beside the feeder, while frost still clung to the grass like scattered glass. And strangely, the uncertainty no longer hurt, because somewhere along the way, the narrator stopped waiting for proof and started paying attention to presence instead. The house still carried memories in every corner. The second coffee mug remained tucked in the back of the cabinet. Certain songs still made the room feel smaller. Some evenings still arrived with that sudden ache that grief leaves behind when least expected. But now there were moments in between the sadness that felt different, quieter, warmer, more connected to the world outside the window. One late January morning, nearly 3 months after the first appearance, the narrator stepped onto the porch just after sunrise while cold wind moved gently through the trees. The yard was empty except for fresh snow and long shadows stretching across the fence line. For a moment, there was no Cardinal anywhere in sight, and yet something inside them still felt calm. Then, far off near the edge of the woods behind the neighborhood, a single red shape lifted briefly through the bare branches before disappearing into the pale morning light. The narrator smiled without fully understanding why. Maybe some things are not meant to be explained completely. Maybe grief changes the way people notice the world. Or maybe certain moments arrive in life carrying meanings too personal for logic to fully hold. Many people believe signs appear when we need them most. Others believe the human heart simply searches for comfort inside patterns and memory. But perhaps the truth lives quietly somewhere in between those two things. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If stories like this speak to something deep inside you, subscribe before you leave, because there are still so many quiet mysteries in this world that most people pass by without ever truly seeing. And maybe somewhere outside your own window tonight, beneath the sound of wind moving through the trees, something small and feathered is waiting patiently to be noticed. Maybe it was only a bird, but it never felt like only a bird.